If you're planning on driving anywhere in the United States this year, there are changes rolling out right now that could genuinely catch you off guard. And most of them didn't come with a headline explaining what they actually mean for your wallet. These aren't hypothetical proposals sitting in some committee room either. Several of them are already active in parts of the country and expanding fast, while others are close enough to becoming law that ignoring them would be a mistake. I'm going to walk you through what's actually changing with distracted driving enforcement, how camera technology on the road is quietly getting stricter, why the number that defines a DUI is shifting in a handful of states, and what's happening to registration costs if you drive an electric vehicle. Stay with me through all of it because the piece about how enforcement itself works has changed in a way that surprises even careful drivers who've never gotten a ticket in their life. Let's start with the one touching the most people right now, which is what happens when a police officer sees you holding your phone. For years, in a lot of states, distracted driving was treated as what's called a secondary offense, meaning an officer could only cite you for it if they'd already pulled you over for something else first, speeding, a broken taillight, whatever it happened to be. That's changed in most states now. The shift is toward what's called primary enforcement, which means an officer can pull you over specifically because you're holding your phone. Full stop. No other violation required. States like Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania have already made this shift, and it's spreading. And here's the detail that trips people up the most. This doesn't just apply while you're driving down the highway. In a growing number of these states, holding your phone while sitting at a red light, engine running, car in park, still counts. You don't have to be moving. You don't have to be actively typing anything. Simply holding the device in your hand while you're behind the wheel is enough. Washington's version of this, sometimes called the EDUI law, treats any handheld use, texting, browsing, even scrolling, as a citable offense, and first-time fines there run around $136, climbing past $235 for a second offense. Multiply that kind of structure across dozens of states adopting similar rules, and you start to see why this one small habit, glancing at a buzzing phone in the cup holder, is turning into one of the most common and most avoidable tickets on the road today. The fix for this one is almost embarrassingly simple, but it only works if you actually commit to it before you're pulled over, not after. Mount your phone somewhere secure before you start driving. Use voice commands for texts, calls, and navigation instead of touching the screen. And if something genuinely can't wait, pull into a parking lot, put the car in park, and handle it there. It costs you 2 or 3 extra minutes. It's not worth the fine, and it's definitely not worth what happens to your insurance afterward. Because a lot of insurers now factor distracted driving citations into your premium the same way they would a speeding ticket. That leads directly into the second major shift, which is happening less through new legislation and more through technology quietly expanding behind the scenes. Automated enforcement, meaning speed cameras and red light cameras, is spreading into more cities and along more stretches of highway than at any point before. And it's not just that there are more cameras now. It's that the way they measure violations is getting more sophisticated. Some regions are moving toward what's called average speed enforcement, where a camera captures the moment you enter a stretch of road and another captures when you exit, then calculates your actual average speed across that entire distance. That means slowing down the instant you spot a camera on the shoulder doesn't help the way it used to, because the system isn't measuring a single snapshot anymore. It's measuring your whole trip through that zone. This approach is specifically designed to catch the kind of speeding that happens on long stretches of highway, the sort that traditional single-point cameras were never built to detect. If you've gotten used to driving by feel on familiar roads, easing off only when you see a camera housing up ahead, this is exactly the habit that's about to stop working. And it's worth understanding why before you're the one explaining a ticket that arrived in the mail 2 weeks after a drive you don't even remember clearly anymore. Now here's the change that deserves the most careful attention because it involves a number a lot of people assume is fixed and settled: the blood alcohol limit that defines a DUI. For decades, 0.08% has been the standard threshold nearly everywhere in the country. That's starting to shift. A handful of states are actively considering, and in some cases moving forward with, a lower threshold of 0.05%, following a model Utah adopted a few years back as the first state in the nation to make that change. Washington has legislation on the table right now specifically proposing this exact shift, and lawmakers in New York and Hawaii have shown similar interest. It's important to be precise here, because this isn't uniformly the law everywhere yet. Some of it is proposed rather than finalized, but the direction is unmistakable, and it's worth understanding what it would actually mean for you if it passes in your state. Going from 0.08 to 0.05 sounds like a small technical adjustment on paper. In practice, it's a significant shift in how much room for error you actually have. For a lot of people, 0.05% works out to somewhere around 1 to 2 drinks, depending on body weight and how quickly you're drinking, compared to 2 or 3 drinks under the older threshold. That means the version of the evening where you have a glass of wine with dinner, feel completely normal, and assume you're fine to drive the 10 minutes home is exactly the scenario that shifts from being legal to being a potential DUI in any state that adopts this lower limit. And the financial fallout from a DUI conviction goes well beyond the initial fine. Between court costs, potential attorney fees, mandatory education programs, and insurance premiums that can climb sharply and stay elevated for several years afterward, the total cost of a single conviction routinely runs into the thousands of dollars, sometimes considerably more depending on the state and the circumstances. The honest, simple takeaway here isn't complicated. If you've had anything to drink and you're not certain exactly where that leaves you under a tightening standard, it's not worth finding out the hard way. A ride-share home costs a fraction of what a conviction does, in money and in stress. The last major shift affects a specific and growing group of drivers directly, and it's one a lot of people don't see coming until their registration renewal shows up looking different than expected. If you drive an electric vehicle, registration costs are climbing in a lot of states, and the reasoning behind it is fairly straightforward, even if it doesn't feel great to absorb. Roads have historically been funded through gas taxes collected at the pump, and electric vehicles simply don't generate that revenue. So as EV adoption grows, states are looking for another way to fund the roads everyone still drives on. The result is a wave of new or increased annual fees specifically for electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles. Pennsylvania's fee is rising to $250 annually as of this year. New Jersey's EV fee has climbed toward the $260 range, with further scheduled increases each year through the end of the decade. Georgia's annual EV fee has risen to roughly $235, and Michigan now charges some of the steepest rates in the country after a major legislative overhaul tied to road funding, with electric vehicle fees climbing well past $250 a year once weight-based charges are factored in. Beyond flat annual fees, some states are experimenting with per-mile road usage charges instead, where you're billed based on how many miles you actually drive rather than a flat yearly amount, an approach already in place in a few states and expanding. None of this means owning an EV suddenly makes no financial sense. Plenty of states still offer offsetting incentives like reduced registration in the early years or access to carpool lanes, But if you bought an electric vehicle assuming your only ongoing cost would be electricity instead of gas, this is worth factoring into your actual annual budget rather than discovering it for the first time when a renewal notice lands with a number you weren't expecting. So here's what's actually worth doing with all of this before any of it catches you personally off guard. Start by simply checking your own state's specific rules rather than assuming national trends apply exactly the same way where you live, since enforcement details, fine amounts, and BAC thresholds vary considerably state to state and are still shifting in real time. If you haven't already, get in the habit of mounting your phone before you start driving and relying on voice commands, since that single habit change eliminates the single most common new violation almost entirely. If you live somewhere with expanding camera enforcement, understand that driving by feel and slowing down only when you spot a camera is no longer a reliable strategy, particularly as average speed zones spread. If you drink at all before driving, build in a buffer of caution rather than assuming the older, more familiar threshold still applies everywhere, since that math is actively shifting under a growing number of states. And if you own or are considering an electric vehicle, look up your specific state's current and scheduled registration fees so the actual cost of ownership factors accurately into your budget rather than surprising you at renewal time. None of these changes require a lawyer or a specialist to navigate. They simply require knowing they exist before they show up as a ticket, a citation, or an unexpected line item on a renewal notice, which is exactly why understanding them now, rather than after the fact, is what actually protects your wallet this year.